Hey, it's Eiley. You're listening to Pure Light, where your worthiness is never the question. The question is, can you feel it? This is episode 5, and today I'm going to talk about how to change what you believe about yourself. Before we get into that, I want to talk just very briefly about why this is important. I think that a lot of us have beliefs about ourselves that can really limit what we think is possible for us. It's like an automatic reaction. So an opportunity comes up, or we have a desire that maybe we're scared to act on. And then the mind automatically goes to, I can't do that because I'm not that kind of person. And it's a limiting belief if you actually want to do the thing in question. So if you want to take that opportunity or fulfill that desire, and then you believe you can't do it, that's a problem because it means that the belief is getting in the way of you having what you want. This is something I've experienced myself many times. One of the strongest beliefs that I had about myself was that I am not a creative person. So a few years ago, I had this strong desire to write a book. It kind of came out of nowhere. Writing was not something that I did regularly at that point in time. And it seemed like just this weird calling. It was like, you need to write a book. And so my initial reaction to that was like, I can't do that because I'm not a writer. And more than that, I felt like I was not a creative person. And only creative people in my mind were people who are allowed to spend time doing things like writing or making other kinds of art, whatever they are. So my automatic belief there was like, I can't write a book because I'm not a writer and I'm not creative. So you can imagine that when I had this desire to write the book, there was a lot of resistance. Part of it was that I didn't consider myself to be a creative person. Part of it was because the work seemed frivolous because I wasn't a creative person. And because my background's in engineering and, that's all based on logic and scientific proof. And part of it was also that I thought that my writing sucked. That's a whole other story. I actually wrote a post on that at one point. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And so I felt really conflicted about even trying to write this book because part of me wanted it and then part of me didn't, and part of me thought it wasn't ever going to be possible. And so I remember thinking like, I need to change what I believe is possible here. Like, this is the choice. I can either choose to kind of continue as I'm going now and have that sense of conflict, or I can choose to challenge this belief that I have that I'm not creative and that I shouldn't be writing. And it was around that point that I remembered that a friend at work had told me years earlier about this photographer who did a photo a day just as a creativity practice. So it was a way of being creative and using his photography skills. And I decided to take that on as a challenge for myself. So I decided to start posting a photo a day on Instagram. And initially my target was just 30 days. I was like, if I can do this for a month, maybe I can start to shift that belief that I'm not a creative person. And I actually really enjoyed it. So around just a couple of days before the month was over, I decided to extend it to 2 months, so to 60 days. And then shortly before the 60 days was up, I decided to extend it to a year because I was like, I really want to master this thing. And then when I was in Kundalini teacher training, one of the things that they teach is that when you do something for 1,000 days, that's when mastery happens. That's when the habit or the behavior really gets rooted in your consciousness. So at some point, I decided to extend this photo a day thing to 1,000 days. And I want to be clear about something here. So for me, success here was not about the photos themselves. It wasn't really about what they looked like, although I tried to make them look like something that made me feel good. And it also wasn't about gaining followers. It was just about the act of doing something creative and doing it consistently. And there were many points in that 1,000-day journey where I wanted to give up. Like, I was annoyed with it. I was like, why am I doing this? Is this even going to work? And there were other points where I loved it. And so somehow I just managed to keep going and keep posting a photo a day. And anyway, I didn't know how this was going to turn out. Like, I didn't know if this was actually going to change anything in terms of what I thought about myself and what I thought about my creative capabilities. But as it turns out, about 3 weeks before the 1,000 days was up, I had the thought, I'm an artist, pop into my mind, which was a thought that I had never had before in my life. I had always had this mental block around creativity and being a creative person and seeing myself as a creative person. So that was not part of my reality. So to have that thought was a really significant shift because it's something that happened naturally. And it was a huge departure from that automatic reaction of, I'm not a creative person. So what's the lesson here? Changing what you believe about yourself isn't about trying to convince yourself that you're something you're not, because that's ultimately going to just create mental conflict. So there's part of you that wants something, and then there's part of you that's saying that it's not possible. So there's a sense of inner resistance, and there's also a sense of stuckness because you feel like you can't move forward because of who you think you are. And I think also at another level, it creates a lack of self-acceptance because you ultimately wish you were different than you are. So changing your beliefs is not about trying to convince yourself of anything. It's about changing what you do. Changing what you believe about yourself happens naturally when you choose to show up in the world in a different way. Because ultimately what happens then is you create evidence that you are that kind of person because you see yourself doing the thing that you thought you couldn't do. You see yourself displaying that characteristic or that quality that you thought you didn't have. Every choice you make and every action you take fuels what you think and believe about yourself. So when you change your actions and your choices, you have the power to change your beliefs. I found a quote from Oprah that confirms this in her experience. Here's what she said. I used to pray for the discipline to lose weight. My diary is literally filled with prayers to God. Please give me the willpower. Then when I finally did it, I realized you don't pray for discipline. You get discipline by doing it. It wasn't until I made the decision to be true to my word that my prayers were answered. I began to work out every morning, whether I liked it or not. And before long, I started to behave and look like a disciplined person. So changing what you believe about yourself ultimately begins with the choice to take different actions. If there's a belief that you have about yourself that's getting in your way or holding you back in some way, ask yourself, what can I do to challenge this? It doesn't have to be a huge leap. It can be a small step. So take one photo, walk around the block. Whether it's about creativity or discipline or something else, figure out what that first step would look like. And then ask yourself, how can I incorporate this into my life on a regular basis? Because that's ultimately when it'll become part of what you consider to be normal or your spectrum of reality. If you choose to take this on, I would love to hear what belief you're challenging and what you're doing about it. Share what you're doing using the hashtag PureLightPodcast on Instagram or Twitter. I'll share another quote with you as well. This one's from Van Gogh. If you hear a voice within you say, you cannot paint, then by all means, paint, and that voice will be silenced. Thanks for listening. Until next time, may you be guided by your light.